Ryan, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, thank you. Welcome. I'm glad to be here. I'm Brian Holly. Know me as Coach Ryan. I'm on social media. I am a internet relationship and dating coach, and I do specialize in attachment theory.
Ryan, I love your content. I know I say this to everyone that I get on my podcast because it's my podcast and I like to get people whose content I love, but I watch your videos all the time. And I think that the way you break down, particularly avoidant attachment, is amazing. All right, so let's start with what is attachment theory?
Attachment theory, without getting too academic here, is how people learn to manage emotional and relationship situations and stress. It's
Mm,
usually starting from childhood. Everybody is born with their temperament. And then as a kid, you don't have much control over your environment. Your parents tell you when it's time to eat, when it's time to get dressed, when you're going to school. So as a child, you learn to manage your environment with your parents or caretakers. And it can depend on if your parents are emotionally present, if they're not, if there's abuse, if there's no abuse. And this management system becomes attachment because you learn emotional intimacy from your parents. This will shape how you view future romantic relationships. Now, other things can influence it, like the relationships you do have as an adult. They can push you further into insecure attachment or make you more secure. We'll get into that. But it really is how people attach to others and manage emotional and relationship stress.
and what causes specifically avoidant attachment?
So, avoidant attachment starts almost always in childhood. Yes, it can, in rare instances, start as an adult, but it almost always starts in
Mm,
childhood. And it is the result of emotional neglect. Now, it doesn't mean that the child was abused. Now, there's two type of avoidance, by the way. There's dismissive and there's fearful. The dismissive avoidant usually just experienced neglect, usually not physical or emotional abuse, but they had parents that maybe often didn't say, I love you. Their feelings were often dismissed. They weren't able to express their feelings as children. So they learned to bottle up their emotions and they learned that you can't rely on anybody for your emotional needs. Fearful avoidance, well, they also got the emotional neglect, but quite often there was chaos or turmoil inside the household as children, and possibly even physical or emotional abuse. So they develop an anxious attachment as well as an avoidant attachment.
Um, I think that one of the most common questions that I get as a narcissistic abuse educator is, are they just an avoidant or are they a narcissist? And most of my clients who come to me about dealing with a narcissistic relationship initially thought that they were dealing with an avoidant.
The overlap in the behavior can be quite confusing because a lot of the
Yeah.
behaviors between a narcissist and an avoidant are very similar. Now, in mind, narcissism is a personality disorder.
Yeah.
Avoidant is an attachment style, meaning it's a learned behavior, and any learned behavior can be unlearned. So, first of all, the intent is different between a narcissist and an avoidant. A narcissist, well, they seek narcissistic supply,
Yeah.
but the avoidant, on the other hand, is motivated by fear. All of their behaviors are fear based and also combine that with a low self esteem. And that's how you get a lot of these behaviors. But an avoidant can change.
Right.
Expecting change from a narcissist, oh, good luck.
And I think that that's the most damaging thing that happens when people think that they're dealing with an avoidant and they're dealing with a narcissist because they go into all of this stuff about attachment theory and how to be in a relationship with an avoidant if they are anxiously attached. And I think the responsibility in that avoidant anxious relationship is often heavily put on the anxious person to change their behavior in order to have the avoidant become more comfortable and change their behavior. And the issue with that is that if they're dealing with a narcissist, there is nothing that they can do, no way that they can modify themselves that will change the narcissist.
That is absolutely true. Keep in mind, modifying yourself is not going to be very productive with an avoidant either. So, one of the biggest problems in a relationship with somebody who's avoidant is a lack of emotional intimacy. Avoidance at their core fear abandonment. They fear it just like an anxious attachment. However, the way this fear manifests itself is very, very different between an avoidant and an anxious person. The avoidant feels that abandonment is inevitable. So when emotional intimacy grows, they've learned from childhood that leads to abandonment. So they pull away. So if you modify your behavior to cater to the avoidant, essentially you're walking on eggshells, you're not being your true authentic self, you are enabling the avoidant behavior, and you're going to just maintain a relationship that has little to no emotional intimacy, that is completely unfulfilling for the partner.
Is there any other way of having a relationship with an avoidant?
Not if they're not doing the work. Now,
Yeah.
if an avoidant is actually doing the work, going to therapy, preferably a psychotherapist,
Hmm.
committing to an actual change in behavior, becoming a responsive person instead of reactive, yes, they can learn to become good partners. But as long as they are unhealed and unworked and they're not working on themselves, there's no way to sustain a healthy relationship with somebody who's severely avoidant.
And they have to, yeah, be willing to look at themselves, which is unlikely if they're severely avoidant. I think it's interesting that you say that the avoidant is fueled by this fear of abandonment and fear of emotional intimacy. And that's one of the big differences between a narcissist and an avoidant is that the narcissist changes their behavior because they're looking for power and control. They're trying to maintain power and control over their partner. And when they pull away, it's usually for punishment or to induce some kind of emotional reaction.
When the avoidant pulls away, it's out of fear, and they're doing it to
Yeah.
sabotage emotional intimacy. Typically,
Mm.
an avoidant will pull away when things are going really well in the relationship.
Mm.
You might have had a great holiday together, or celebrated Christmas, or
Mm-hmm.
went on a fun trip somewhere, and things seem like they were closer than ever before. And that's typically what will trigger them because emotional intimacy was building. So the avoidant pulls away out of fear as a way to keep their partner at an emotional arm's length. The purpose of it is to sabotage emotional intimacy. So when emotional intimacy is broken, the avoidant feels safe again.
Yeah. So those are deactivating strategies, aren't they?
Yes, and there are other deactivating strategies which can
Yeah.
often confuse people and make them think that they're a narcissist because some of the
And that they're being
deactivating strategies
devalued.
are
Mm.
cheating, devaluing,
Mm.
nitpicking,
Mm-hmm.
gaslighting, stonewalling. A lot of those toxic behaviors that are commonly associated with narcissists, avoidance
Mm.
can do too, but with different intent.
Yeah. So how would you explain to someone the difference in trajectory of like the relationship pattern between an avoidant relationship and a narcissistic relationship?
Well, it can go a couple of different ways. Typically, just like the narcissist, an avoidant is going to start out by love bombing their partner.
Yeah.
Now, avoidants love bomb for an entirely different reason. They have a
Mm.
lifetime of suppressing their emotions. They learn to avoid and suppress their emotions. They bottle them up.
Mm.
Early in the relationship isn't real yet. It's a fantasy. It is a fantasy world.
Yeah.
It's a romance novel. So the avoidant will let all of these bottled up emotions just flow right out of them. And they'll do a lot of the similar behaviors to a narcissist. They'll even future fake, promise you the
Mm.
world. But then as the relationship becomes real,
Yeah.
well, a couple things can happen. The avoidant can cut it off right then and there without even getting to any kind of devaluation stage. Just
Yeah.
blindside the partner and discard them in a very similar manner to how a narcissist would do it. Or they can slowly start to nitpick this person and do toxic behaviors as ways to reduce emotional intimacy, which
Mm.
ultimately then leads up to the inevitable discard.
Yeah. And I think that it's important to note that in a narcissistic relationship, you're going to follow that pattern of idealize, devalue, discard, hoover, re enter the cycle. Idealize, devalue, discard, hoover. Do avoidants do that?
They do. They do.
They do?
They do it, but for a different intent. It's
Okay.
entirely different intention behind it because the
Yeah.
devaluation is the avoidant trying to destroy emotional intimacy out of
Yeah.
fear. And then typically they will discard a partner, blindside them, show no empathy, completely
Yeah.
shut down. And then after no contact is used, well, suddenly the avoidant is allowing themselves to access their feelings again and they can miss the partner and try to
Mm.
rekindle it because they think they made a big mistake. And then the
Yeah.
cycle starts all over again.
Yeah. Okay. You've gotten some backlash about using the word discard in terms of an avoidant relationship.
I have, but in my opinion, everyone has a right to their own. A
Yeah.
discard is the behavior, not the intent. So
Yeah.
when you are being discarded by an avoidant or a narcissist, the behavior is very, very similar. You're being
Mm,
blindsided. You're not being given any explanation, being given any closure, and it's a unilateral decision. You're deprived of a voice or a say in the breakup,
yeah.
and little to no empathy is shown. So the
Yeah.
behavior is very similar. So my analogy I like to use is, okay, if I'm punching you in the face, but I don't mean to hurt you, does it
Mm,
really matter? You're still getting punched in the face. If somebody is throwing you in the trash like you don't matter, does it really matter whether they're doing it out of fear or out of narcissistic revenge or anything of the sort? No, it doesn't really matter. You're still being thrown in the trash.
yeah. I absolutely agree with you. Um, so you and I have both dated narcissists or been in relationships with narcissists and avoidants. But I think we
Yes,
went the other
indeed.
way around. So I was with an avoidant and then a narcissist, and you were with a narcissist and then an avoidant. Tell me a little bit about your
Yes.
experience.
Well, I was in a long-term relationship with a narcissist, and
Mm,
it started out like, well, I thought I met this wonderful person that was
yeah,
all sorts of into me, and for the love bombing lasted a bit longer than it typically would, but
yeah,
then came all the devaluation, the cheating,
mm,
the affairs, but it was actually it got so bad. It was brutal. And at the time, I didn't really understand what a narcissist was, and I felt like I could
yeah,
do nothing right. I was walking on eggshells, and I would try so hard to please her. I mean, if I bought her, nothing I did was good enough. Like if I bought her flowers, she would get mad at
mm,
me saying I gave her a chore because now she has to water the flowers.
wow,
If I bought a Hallmark card and wrote a note in it and left that as a surprise, well, it wasn't good enough because it's a store-bought card, so it didn't mean anything. Everything I did, there was some sort of fault in it, and I was kind of mentally spiraling. But it got to the point where I actually decided to leave the narcissist before I got discarded. I had
okay,
enough. I got fed up.
yeah,
Um, so after some time had gone by and I had healed from that, I met the avoidant, and she
yeah,
also love bombed me as well. And I thought this one, the connection was, I thought it was out of this world. It seemed
mm,
amazing, and things were going well. And then all of a sudden, completely blindsided by text without any kind of warning whatsoever. I was floored. I really didn't see that coming at all.
mm, wow, yeah. I think that looking back, my relationship with the avoidant, I got kicked back so far into anxious attachment, and I was an absolute mess by the end of that relationship. But it lined me up to walk straight into the arms of a narcissist who was pretending to be the opposite of everything that my ex was.
It often happens. What I find, especially with a lot of clients that I coach, and
Mm,
even just people that comment on my videos, is there's a common pattern that people have experiences with both an
yeah.
avoidant and a narcissist. Not always in the same order, but
Mm,
when you are in a more anxious state, you are going to be more vulnerable to being love bombed because it's like a drug.
exactly.
It's alluring.
Yeah.
It sucks you in. You feel seen and you feel
Yeah.
validated. And but then when the red flags start to pop up, whether it's narcissistic red flags or avoidant red
Sweep those under
flags,
the
well,
carpet.
you're already, yeah, you don't want to pay attention because that love bombing was so good and you don't want to lose this
Exactly.
person. Now you're
Yeah.
now you're Mr. or Miss Anxious, and
Yeah.
you're ignoring things that you shouldn't have ignored otherwise.
Absolutely. Yeah. Don't date when you're broken, guys. Don't date from a place of need.
Absolutely.
I saw one of your videos where you were talking about how avoidants just want an easy relationship. They don't want to communicate their needs. They don't want to talk about things. They just want something easy. Let's talk about that a little bit. What do they mean when they say they just want something easy?
What they mean by something easy is something without quote unquote pressure. So
Mm,
understand avoidants are emotionally unavailable. They are walled off. They prevent
yeah.
a deep emotional connection from forming with their partner. They like to keep
Mm,
things surface level. When they are with a partner that is emotionally available, they feel an unspoken pressure to be available and
Yes.
vulnerable in return for this person, which makes it feel not easy. So when they are in a relationship with somebody who is emotionally unavailable, this could be another avoidant, a narcissist, a borderline, could be any of those things. The
Yeah.
avoidant will feel safe, even though the relationship is toxic. It'll feel easy because there's no pressure for them to be vulnerable with somebody who's not vulnerable with them.
Mm, interesting. Yeah. And when I was in that relationship, he literally said those things. I remember one of the issues was because we were in a long distance relationship. And I was like, oh, I need like a text every morning so I know that you're thinking about me. And he was like, oh, sending a text in the morning, that's just so much pressure. I just feel really pressured. This is like a bit too much for me. I don't know if I can send you a message in the morning. And I'm like, I feel like it's kind of a bare minimum thing that I'm asking for here. And then he would have this like protest behavior where he would send it, but he would send it at 11:59, like just in the morning.
It's Here's the thing is that avoidants are people that have a certain set of fears: abandonment, engulfment, rejection. And
Yeah,
the fear of engulfment, losing their independence, it ties into fear of abandonment, and so does
yeah,
rejection. So they have a certain set of fears, and it's emotionally healthy, emotionally available partners asking for the bare minimum. That is actually what triggers, because that
mm,
means they have to give something to this relationship, and
yeah.
that is scary. They Whenever they are quote unquote pressured to participate in the relationship beyond them just soaking up the validation, well, that's
Um,
not easy. That's pressure. They don't know if they can do that.
yeah, yeah. And then you get those kind of protest behaviors and the deactivating strategies and things like that as well. In terms of sabotaging intimacy, you said before that generally it's when the relationship is going well and something amazing, you've gone away together, you've had a great time, and then they'll start maybe devaluing you or criticizing you or saying something insensitive to sabotage that intimacy. What can that look
That's
like?
exactly often when it's done. Well, imagine you just went on a holiday to Europe together. You had the time of your
Mm,
lives. You grew close to this person. You felt like, okay, this is it. I met my person. You fly back.
yeah,
And the next day, they're not responding to your texts. Oh, it takes
yeah,
them 12 hours to respond, and they give a one-word answer. Or they start to put you down in little ways. They criticize
mm,
your looks. They criticize your hair. They find little faults in everything you do. They start a petty argument out of nowhere. Or they just disappear for days. You don't hear from them for
yeah,
3 days. And then they come and say, oh, I was just busy.
yeah. And then have a really bad reaction if you try and call them out on it.
Yes, which means the bad reaction is getting upset and then usually pulling away further.
Yeah. Would you say that similar to narcissists, that avoidance perceive criticism a lot because they also have a lot of core shame?
Yes, shame is at the core of somebody who is avoidant, and
Yeah.
they don't handle criticism very well. Criticism becomes all encompassing to them.
Mm,
So that's why they avoid accountability. They really avoid it like the
yeah.
plague, because if they take ownership of even a small mistake in their minds, it means that they are a failure of a person, that they
Yeah.
are no good. So they can't take even the smallest criticism because they are filled with a ton of shame. And shame really is actually a toxic emotion.
Yeah.
It serves no actually healthy benefit to the person feeling it.
And in this sense, I mean, narcissistic personality disorder and severe avoidance do look very similar. I would say, though, like one of the biggest differences is that, and we'll go over some of the differences, but one of the biggest differences is that avoidance genuinely can feel empathy.
They can, and they often do. The one time where avoidance will really show a lack of empathy is when they are actually doing a discard of a partner. But that lack of empathy is only there for a bit. Typically, after a little bit of time has gone by, they can start to feel really bad. But while
Mm,
they're doing the act, they're deactivated and they just won't let themselves go there. But they can
yeah.
genuinely feel empathy in a way that a narcissist can't. And there's also a level of cruelty in general that comes from a narcissist that
Yeah.
isn't quite there with an avoidant,
Yeah.
because avoidants don't enjoy being cruel to a person, whereas a narcissist can get supply for
Yeah, because the narcissist is like consciously trying to psychologically and emotionally break you down in order to make you controllable. And that's absolutely not what's happening with an avoidant.
Exactly.
Yeah. What are some of the other differences between an avoidant and a narcissist?
Well, one of the biggest differences is that an avoidant actually can heal and change. Now,
Yes.
avoidant, they can
Yeah.
actually they can learn to actually do the work and change. And I do
Mm.
routinely see a lot of avoidants that change. Actually, a lot of people that I work with are
Okay.
avoidants that are looking to change, and they can accomplish it. They absolutely can. Avoidance, just like narcissists, they do struggle to self-reflect. Well, narcissists don't self-reflect at all, but avoidants
Mhm.
have a hard time with it. But avoidance can self-reflect, whereas good luck getting self-reflection out of a narcissist.
Yeah. I think it's interesting. A lot of the time people ask what attachment style narcissists have. And it's like, look, narcissists can have different attachment styles. Like you often say, they're essentially avoidant at the core because of their inability to emotionally connect and their inability for deep emotional intimacy and things like that. But at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter what their attachment style is because a narcissist is someone that has a personality disorder. And like you said before, they can't change. And when we're looking at what type of attachment style a person has, we have to apply that to people who are normal enough, healthy enough. It's different when you're dealing with a personality disorder.
That's absolutely right. When you're dealing with a personality disorder, the best case scenario is that this person can learn to manage and regulate their behaviors a bit better.
Yeah.
When you're dealing with somebody who is severely avoidant or even severely anxious, if the person's motivated and they want to become secure and they are truly willing to do the work, which usually includes therapy um, and various other techniques, that
Mm.
person can become secure and that person can
So,
end up becoming a wonderful partner for somebody.
okay. How often does that happen though,
Not as often
particularly with
as it should.
avoidance?
So
Yeah.
um, I do see it. I mean, I
Okay.
do see it all the time, but as a percentage whole, it's a low percentage because the problem with avoidance are that they avoid self-reflection because that's painful and they don't want to face painful emotions or take
Yeah.
accountability. So due to the lack of self-reflection, just like narcissists, they often have emotionally stunted growth. Their emotional age
Mhm.
is kind of childlike because they don't allow themselves to grow emotionally. So it is a challenge for them. It is harder to get them to do it because of how avoidant they are of self-reflection. So I would say, it's not great odds, but it can happen. It does absolutely happen
Mm. And you work with avoidance to help them to become more secure?
every day.
Mm.
Sometimes they have that light bulb moment. They'll be watching one of my videos or someone else's video, and they're like, oh my God, that's me. And
Yeah.
then they start to do the work. And it's amazing. Some of these people, you can see the transformation and the change in them. It's not that I'm waving a magic wand, it's that this person
Mm.
now has a self-awareness and a commitment to actually healing old attachment wounds, changing behavior. And they can actually do this process a lot faster than you might think. Because the human
Okay.
mind learns in repetition. The more you repeat a new healthy behavior, the more automatic it becomes. A lot of it, when it comes to changing, just requires willpower, not reverting to the old emotional reactions when they're triggered and learning to respond to triggers instead of reacting.
Yeah. Okay. But would you say that that's much less common that an avoidant is actually going to go and get help and change? Because I'm just thinking of all of the people with strong anxious attachment styles that are currently in relationships with avoidants, potentially watching this, hoping that they can strong arm their avoidant into therapy and get them to change.
Yeah, your odds aren't good. I'm just going to be flat out.
Yeah.
Your odds are not good.
Just
Is
want to
it
get that
possible?
in.
Yes, but it usually requires the avoidant hitting rock bottom. Now,
Mm.
everybody's rock bottom is different. Some people never hit rock bottom.
Yeah.
But for some avoidants, that rock bottom is the point where they actually suffer the consequences of their own actions, the natural
Okay.
consequences, meaning that they lose somebody or potentially lose somebody that they actually care about because of their actions. And that can be the wake up call.
Do they feel a lot of pain initially though when they lose someone? Don't they kind of just bury it and keep rolling?
No, they don't. They avoid it. I mean, hence avoidant.
Yeah.
What they do is they feel a sense of relief after they lose somebody, because
Yeah.
they're no longer pressured to be available or
Mhm.
vulnerable for somebody in a relationship. And they try to avoid and distract themselves from the pain as long as they can. Now, the ones that
Yeah.
monkey branch, monkey branch being serial
Yeah.
dating, the ones that monkey branch sometimes never process it because they're always distracting themselves with the new relationship. So they never actually process the pain of previous breakups. The ones that
Mhm.
don't monkey branch over a period of time eventually get to the point where they can't bottle up it anymore and they start to actually feel the loss and the pain.
Yeah. Okay. I was talking recently to someone about trauma bonding. Trauma bonding is a type of intense attachment that forms through a cycle of abuse and repair or extreme highs and lows. And we typically see it in relationships with narcissists, between a narcissist and their partner or a narcissist and their victim. But it's interesting that a similar type of unhealthy attachment can form with an avoidant just through the cycle of inconsistencies. And someone,
It
particularly who's
absolutely
anxious,
can.
can get unhealthily almost addicted through that cycle of inconsistencies with an avoidant. And that's certainly what happened to me in my relationship. I got incredibly anxious and it was like this intermittent like highs and lows. And I found it really hard when that relationship ended to let go.
It really can, and it's a very similar thing, and especially with fearful avoidance. So fearful
Mm-hmm.
avoidance, they have an anxious side of them, unlike a dismissive avoidant. And the fearful avoidance are much more likely to really do prolonged sabotaging behaviors. They're more likely to drag out like the kind of devaluation, things like that. And fearful avoidance are also more likely to come back for their version of the Hoover. They're more likely to do that more often. Sometimes you can have somebody that's broken up with the avoidant 7, 8, 9, 10 times, and they keep on coming back, doing this whole
Yeah.
process: devalue, discard, come back, love bomb, devalue, discard. And this intermittent reinforcement can be very addicting. And it has a very similar effect as it does with a narcissist. Again, the
Mm-hmm.
intent is different. It really
Yeah.
is a much different intent. But
Mm.
sometimes the behavior is so similar, it can be really hard to tell with what you're dealing with.
Um, and I think it's also important to note something else that you also talk about is that it's not necessarily that a person originally has an anxious attachment. A very secure person can become very anxious in a relationship with a dismissive avoidant.
Yes, it happens all of
Yeah.
the time. So, I don't have a stat on this, but all I can go by is
Mm.
personal experience with the tons of clients that I've worked with. I find personally, at least in my experience, it's just as common, maybe slightly more common, that a person that is more secure actually gets into a relationship with an avoidant and then becomes more anxious and then becomes convinced that they're a severe anxious attacher, when in reality, they allow themselves to get sucked into a relationship with somebody who is emotionally unavailable and allowed themselves to erode their own boundaries, resulting in
Uh,
anxiety.
yeah, yeah, absolutely. I was never particularly anxious before that relationship. It's interesting how avoidants kind of create their own nightmare through their own inconsistencies and pulling away. I found it really interesting when I read Attached by Emile Levine, and they talk about a secure relationship and a secure base, and how, it's just knowing that they're there and checking in and being emotionally available, and that actually stops someone from being anxious and kind of spiraling and needing so much. And so avoidants kind of create this scenario through their inconsistencies. Whereas if they were just a little bit more consistent and they just checked in, they would avoid a lot of the behaviors that they fear but create.
Exactly. Here's the thing about avoidance. This is the conundrum. They actually, at their core, they long for love. They long for emotional connection. They do want it.
Mm,
But the very thing they want is also what they fear. And because their
mm,
fear is so powerful, they create the very thing that they fear. They
yeah,
create abandonment. They make it inevitable by their own behaviors, but those behaviors confirm to themselves things like, see, it wasn't going to work. I was going to get abandoned.
mm,
Or look at what I did. I hurt another person. I am a bad person. And that
yeah,
pushes further into the shame narrative. So their own behaviors are so self-sabotaging and so self-destructive. They create their own loneliness and their own pain. And then they seek further maladaptive behaviors as a way to cope and feel better. And then the cycle just keeps going.
Mm, let's talk a bit more about the narrative that they tell themselves. This is never going to work. We're just not compatible. They just create this whole story.
They really do. And it really depends on, again, if you're, who you're dealing with. I mean, if you're dealing with
Yeah.
a fearful avoidant, you're much more likely to get in the narrative, oh, yeah, this can't work. One tiny little petty argument. Well, that's it. We can't get along. Um,
I
you
just
know,
had a dating experience like this. I started dating this guy and I started getting this anxious feeling and I was like, oh no, I think he's an avoidant. And like we'd had a nice time and then he started picking at me and I was like, is he an avoidant or a narcissist? Because is he devaluing me or is this a deactivating strategy? And then we'd had this interaction where he'd said he was going to call me and he didn't call me. And then he didn't text me all of the next day. And then when he reached out, I was like, hey, you didn't call me. And then we had a conversation. He was like, oh, well, I can't remember to call you. Like, I don't think we're compatible. I don't think this is going to work. I don't want to have a conversation about needs. I don't want to like, and he had this like, and he just like freaked out and bailed. And I was like, whoa, what just
avoidant,
happened?
definitely. So a fearful avoidant is much more likely to have that kind of narrative in their mind. And
Yeah,
a dismissive avoidant is they're going to tell them they're going to have those fears get spiked. Their fears are
yeah,
triggered. It's like an overwhelming fear that they just have to run. And
yeah,
because they don't self-reflect, they have to assign a very surface level explanation as to why
yeah,
they're ditching a partner. A dismissive avoidant will usually tell themselves, well, it must be the wrong person. I wouldn't
yeah,
feel this way.
yeah,
Never minding the fact that they feel this way every time somebody treats them. That's what triggers the fears of abandonment. And that's why they
yeah,
deactivate because guess what? When things are going well, that means emotional intimacy is building, and that's scary.
yeah. Yeah, and he also didn't want to have a conversation about needs or what we need or like, anything like that. He didn't want any kind of expectations or needs whatsoever, and that was very confronting. I think it's really confusing for people when they experience this kind of thing. I mean, when I was initially in that relationship with the avoidant before the narcissist, I had no idea what was wrong with me. I was so anxious all of the time. I was walking on eggshells, like I just felt sick and nervous like the whole time, and I had no idea what was wrong with me until after the relationship and I went into all the research and I learned about attachment theory and then I was like, oh my God, this is me. It's like a standard anxious and avoidant relationship. Like this is a pattern. It was crazy to learn about it.
And there is actually some differences between avoidance and narcissists that they're hard to put your finger on. But people that have been in relationships with both, you do, especially early
There's a
on in the love
difference.
bombing phase, you kind of have a little bit more of a bad intuition with a narcissist, whereas the
Yeah.
avoidant, it feels more genuine. And
Yeah.
that's because they are genuine feelings in the moment. They just don't consistently allow themselves to access those feelings. Whereas with a
Yeah.
narcissist, it's pure manipulation.
Yeah. And oftentimes with a narcissist, you have this strong gut feeling that something's terribly wrong with this person, that they're off, that
Mhm.
there's just something not right about them. And obviously, we suppress that when we're getting love bombed and we get in these relationships. But almost everyone can look back from my experience and see that something felt really wrong. And that's not the case with an avoidant.
I can speak for myself. I had that feeling with the
Yeah.
narcissist that something
Yeah.
was very
Same.
wrong, and I tried to ignore it. Now, it's not the same with the
Yeah.
avoidant, but I will say there is a common gut feeling with the avoidant that you're
Yeah.
still on eggshells because
Anxious.
you're afraid this person could ditch you at any given moment, even if they've never
Yeah.
discarded you yet. Something you pick up on, you just do.
Yeah.
You pick up on, ooh, this person might just head for the hills one day.
Yeah. Absolutely. I'm just thinking, I think it's interesting. So avoidants tend to avoid deep and meaningful conversations and talking about feelings and like really deeply trying to get to know you as a person. Whereas narcissists in the love bombing phase tend to ask you a lot of questions and try to get to know all of your deepest, darkest fears and traumas and things like that, so that they can obviously use those against you and control you in the future. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. I, The avoidant really doesn't want to know all the inner workings of you because that means emotional
Yeah.
intimacy. They'll ask
Mm.
surface level questions like, what are your
Yeah.
hobbies? What do you like to do for fun? They're going to ask that kind of stuff about you. But the
Yeah.
real deep inner working stuff, they don't want to go there.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah. I just thought of that as a bit of a difference. Um, what percentage of the population is avoidant?
So there was a recent study that was done, and about 50% of the population, both men and women, are either narcissistic or insecurely attached. Now,
Yeah.
out of
Only 50%.
the
And the
the
other 50%
50% are
is
secure.
secure. I don't believe that.
Yeah, the other 50% secure. But out of that 50% that is either insecure or narcissistic, they can only go by diagnosed narcissists, which we
Yeah.
know are far fewer than the actual number because most narcissists don't go to get diagnosed, they don't go to therapy. But out of the rest of them, about two-thirds are avoidant and about a third are anxious. So you're much more likely to run into an avoidant than an anxious attacher, and you're more
Yeah.
likely to run into an avoidant than even a narcissist.
Yeah.
Technically, secure people are the majority, but you have to understand secure people generally get locked up into healthy relationships early on, and they're
Yeah.
not as often on the singles market.
And especially on the dating apps, there's a lot of avoidance and narcissists because dating apps are just very quick, easy access to a lot of people.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So, is there a way of determining quicker in early dating if you're dealing with an avoidant?
Absolutely. So there are some telltale signs. Now, some of them, I will say, are very tricky. Some of them are
Mm.
very tricky to tell early on, but there's a lot of common red flags. The biggest red flag of all, which is also the most common, they may even put this on their dating profile,
Okay.
that they are hyper independent or fiercely independent. And this is a tricky one because you know what? It sounds good. And in reality, being
Mm.
an independent adult is a good thing. You should be an independent person. The
Yeah.
difference is it should be a given. And it is the insecure avoidant that feels the need to assert their independence because one of their biggest fears is losing their independence in a relationship.
Yeah.
It's kind of the equivalent of saying, hey, I pay my bills. Well, you should
Mhm.
pay your bills. So why do you feel the need to assert that, right? So being
Yeah.
independent should be a given if you are a grown, functioning, healthy adult. Another
Hmm.
red flag is when they talk about the wall or the guard that they have up, that they've been hurt in the past and they have a wall and a guard, and it takes them time to let their walls down and let somebody in. Everybody should have a healthy skepticism going into a new relationship,
Yeah.
a healthy guard, but it is the emotionally unavailable avoidant that feels the need to assert it because that's not
Understood.
just a wall, that's the Great Wall of China. You're not getting in.
Okay.
in and inconsistent messaging, hot and cold. They're blowing up your phone one day and then
Yeah.
disappear for 3 days.
Absolutely.
And they're always just, oh,
Yes.
I was just busy. Nobody
Yeah.
is too busy to reply a quick 5-second text.
Yeah. Even 2 seconds while you're in the bathroom. Like, yeah.
Exactly.
What about things like emphasizing that they want to take things slowly and they're not in a rush, and if it happens, it happens, and like, I'm not necessarily looking for a relationship, like, let's just go with the flow. And like, do you think that's a sign of an avoidant?
That's a sign of a dismissive avoidance. Absolutely.
Yeah.
Dismissive avoidance are essentially the pure avoidance. Now, a
Mm.
fearful avoidant might
There's an
actually be the
anxious
one to
part.
advance the relationship. Yeah,
Yeah.
they might actually be the one to put a label on the relationship. They'll ask for commitment early on. They'll
Yeah.
introduce you to friends and family and tell you that you're their forever person.
Yeah. Okay. A lot of overlap there with a narcissist. Yeah.
But the fearful avoidant turns into an avoidant as the relationship progresses. They flip the script. They go from anxious to avoidant. And then once
Yeah.
they're in avoidant mode, they deactivate and they can shut down in the same exact way that a dismissive avoidant can.
Okay. Is there generally like a typical time period that the initial love bombing phase with an avoidant lasts before they start to freak out and pull back? Because in narcissistic relationships, it can vary, but it's generally kind of 3 to 6 months is the most typical time period of the love bombing phase before the devaluation starts.
And with an avoidant, it does have a typical time frame. Obviously, just like a narcissist, every person is different, so the time
Mm.
frame really can vary. Now, here's the caveat: avoidants love long distance relationships because it helps them keep their partner at
Yeah,
an emotional arm's length.
yeah.
That can take, so if it's a long distance relationship, it can take years. They can love bomb for
Okay.
years because they're safe. So it can
Yeah,
go 3, 4, 5, 6 years of love bomb. Now, in a
yeah.
relationship with close proximity where you live close to each other, typically 4 months to 8 months is kind of the
Okay.
range of the love bombing. Now, with some fearful avoidance, that love bombing can actually last a year or two.
Okay. Yeah. And then it's like a sudden drop off usually, or it tapers off.
It's usually pretty sudden. All of a sudden, out of
Mm.
nowhere, this person's pulling away, and you detect an immediate shift. Like, what's going on here? All of a sudden, they
Hmm.
just stop replying to texts. They're giving you vague answers. They're really pulling back hard. It's not usually a slow drop off with an avoidant. Now, sometimes it is, but
Yeah.
more often than not, it's pretty darn abrupt.
Yeah. Okay. Interesting. How long was your relationship with the avoidant that you were with?
Just under 5 months.
Right, okay.
Just
Mine
under
was
five
about seven
months.
months. Yeah. Okay. Interesting.
There was no drop off on mine. There was no drop off. There was no tapering
Okay.
off. It was full throttle to nothing.
Yeah. It's interesting that you talk about the long distance relationships because I insisted that we had, because it was only a 3 hour drive, I insisted that we had to see each other at least once a fortnight. And that felt like a lot of pressure for this person.
They do love the long distance. It makes them feel safe
Yeah.
because it helps them keep in the fantasy world. There's less of a commitment when you don't have to see your partner that often. So what
Yeah.
often happens with the long distance relationships is that it goes wonderfully and it can go wonderfully for years
Hmm.
until eventually one of the partners relocates to the other one. When that
Yeah.
happens, that's when they deactivate, shut down, discard.
Well, and that's another overlap with narcissistic relationships because a narcissist will often deliberately leave you hanging high and dry just when you've sacrificed literally everything for them. But
That's true.
oftentimes that's a temporary discard. So like you move across the city, you sell all of your stuff, you move in with them, and then they discard you. But it's like a to break you down in order to come back a couple of weeks later with lowered standards. And then you're so grateful and relieved to have them.
The avoidant does it out of pure fear. They're thinking in their own mind that they're excited that, for example, that you're going to relocate for them. But then when it
Yeah.
gets there, all of a sudden, oh my God, this is real. There's so much pressure.
Hmm.
And it's like a switch goes off. And all of a sudden, they've taken their feelings for their partner. They've buried those feelings. They're not even accessing their own feelings. And they just are completely stone cold and shut down. And it's all fear based. It's not about power and control. It is pure
Yeah.
fear.
Yeah. And then that fear is so overwhelming that they're only thinking about themselves. And it's to the point that they appear to lack empathy because they're just so self focused in that fear.
Exactly. Exactly.
Yeah.
And it's not because they want to hurt you. Well, let's put it this way. They're so self-absorbed in their own feelings and fears and perceived wants and needs that they're not even considering how this feels for the person that they're discarding. They're not considering. It's just an afterthought. Hurting you is not their goal, but they're not exactly going out of their way to not hurt you either.
Yeah. I mean, when I was in the relationship with the avoidant and he ended things, it was on the first year anniversary death of my dad. I
That's often how it goes. That is often how it goes.
was like, okay.
There's often a significant thing like that, a big event. Or here's another thing. They I'm sorry that happened. It's they will do it when there's a stressor too. For example, a health scare, or a financial stress that happened, losing a job. They don't know how to handle life stress very well. So, for
Mhm.
example, if the partner is hospitalized, and let's say you had a heart attack and you're in the hospital, they'll often do it while you're in the hospital. Or if somebody loses a job, they'll do it then. Or if there's a death in the family, they'll do it then because they get overwhelmed very easy. They haven't learned skills to manage life stress. So when these stresses are triggered and they're overwhelmed, they seek things in their lives that they view are disposable so they can reduce their stress load. And the most disposable thing in their life is always their relationship.
Yeah, and something else I noticed, I love referring back to my own relationship. I think it's relatable for people as well, but he couldn't handle these strong emotions. And when I would try, he would freak out to the point I ended up having to comfort him every time. He couldn't even give me a hug. He would have a psychological breakdown if I had any kind of strong emotions. Is that
Not all avoidants do that, though. That was not my
okay?
experience with the avoidant. You know, in hindsight, I now see the red flags, like the hyper independence, inconsistent hot and cold messaging, sometimes busy, sometimes readily available. But
Mhm.
but in person, emotionally, she always seems stable.
Okay. Did you also get that kind of unhealthy attachment to her where you felt almost addicted?
It was like an addiction, and the
Yeah.
ending came out of nowhere, and it felt like it felt like a gut punch. It was I was
Yeah.
just completely devastated, and at that time, I didn't even know what an avoidant was, and I'm like, oh my God,
Yeah.
is this another narcissist? So I
Yeah.
was doing like, how did I miss this? And turns out, no, she's not a narcissist, and she did try to come back. And
Mm,
I wasn't personally, I wasn't willing to go there. Once was
well
enough for
done.
me. So
Mhm.
I said no, and ultimately, I'm glad I did, because I ended up personally ended up meeting an emotionally available, secure partner that is great. So I can't.
Mm, love that for you. That's good though, because I think most people end up going back at least once.
And most people do, and
Yeah.
the one thing I will tell people is that I know the temptation's there. Sometimes it can work out, but see if this person's really committing to do the work. If they are not, you're setting yourself up for hurt again, and you might be taking
Mm,
yourself off the market, and you might be missing out on somebody who is genuinely emotionally available, who really is secure and that wants to be emotionally present in the relationship. Because when you do find someone like that, you forget all about the avoidant. You forget about the narcissist, because it's a
yeah.
much different experience. And you can actually be in a relationship and be present with somebody, not walking on eggshells, and know that this person is not going to just run away and discard you.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's just so worth it. I just wanted to jump back for a second on something that you said that was interesting, and this is another overlap with narcissism that the intention is different, but it looks the same. You said that often they
Yes.
will discard you when something terrible happens because they can't handle the emotional intensity, like you get sick or you lose a job or something like that. Narcissists will also discard you when you need them the most, when you get sick or you lose a job or something terrible happens, but it's because it's a one sided relationship and they're not interested in being there for you. It's if you're no longer serving their purpose, they're done with you.
A perfect example of an on the narcissistic side.
Yeah.
I have a client who thought that he was in a marriage with an avoidant, and
Mm.
obviously I can't
Yeah.
diagnose, but boy, this is definitely textbook narcissistic behavior. He got
Yeah.
hospitalized with a serious issue, a life-threatening issue, and she was mad at him because it was inconvenient to her that he was
Yeah.
in the hospital,
Yeah.
and
I hear
she,
that all the time.
while he's in the hospital, left him for the personal trainer at the gym after
Yeah.
years of marriage.
Yeah.
Now, avoidance, on the other hand, it could be that similar type of health scare, but they just panic. They just panic. They don't say things like to belittle you while you're in the hospital. I just can't do this. I'm overwhelmed. I just can't. This is too much pressure. I can't give you what you need.
Yeah. Absolutely. Can't give you what you need. You deserve better.
You deserve to be loved the way you deserve to be loved. I just need some time and space to heal.
I just have to work on myself.
Yes. I'm just too busy for a relationship right now. Work is just so busy. Right person, wrong time.
Yeah, I just need to go back to
This
basics. I need to go back to the gym. I need to start running. I need to meditate.
it's so funny because I deal with, and so do you, people all over the
Yeah.
world, and I swear, whether it's narcissists or avoidant, it's like they all read the guidebook, how to be
Yeah.
avoidant, how to be a narcissist, because they repeat the same stuff. Even this
Yeah.
might be different languages, but they still say the same lines. It's incredible.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And it's interesting because, we joke about how narcissists are all the same person because they do the same things and the relationship pattern is just so predictable and all of that kind of stuff. But attachment theory is almost as predictable in my experience. Like if you're anxious, it's very
It is.
predictable how you're going to behave in a relationship. If you're avoidant, it's very predictable. Yeah.
It is very predictable. It is very predictable. I would say a little bit of a difference between attachment and personality disorders like narcissism is
Mm.
that it's not all 100% the same. So, for example, someone could be
Yeah.
mildly avoidant or severely avoidant. They could be mildly anxious or severely anxious. A mildly avoidant person actually can be emotionally available. They might just be slower to open up,
Mm.
and maybe they might be a little still afraid of conflict, but this can still be a person that tend to end up being actually a good partner. Whereas a severe
Yeah.
avoidant is completely emotionally unavailable. When it comes to full-blown narcissism, if somebody has narcissism, there's really no mild narcs. They're not.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it does exist on a continuum, and there are people with mild, moderate, and high narcissistic traits that wouldn't qualify for the disorder.
True,
But
true.
once you're dealing with the narcissist, though, the like a pathological narcissist, yeah, they're all the same. They do the same things.
I meant the people with the disorder. Yeah, you can have
Yeah,
narcissistic traits
absolutely.
and not be a full-blown narcissist. But once you're in the land of disorder, it's good luck.
Game over. All right. So, what advice would you give to someone who is anxious? Because let's be honest, they're the ones watching this video, listening to this podcast, trying to look for answers.
Yes. So, couple quick pieces of advice here. One, and this is the most important one that I can give, and it really is crucial. Stop blaming yourself for other people's
Mm,
behavior. When somebody discards you or gaslights you, stonewalls you, ghosts you, you are not responsible for that. You can't control other people. When you take personal responsibility for somebody else's behavior, you are trying to control the uncontrollable because you can only control
mm,
yourself. And you are pushing yourself further into anxiousness and anxiety and that self blame. And that self blame pushes you further into insecurity. You're talking shame, all those kind of things. Remind yourself if a person shows unhealthy behavior, that unhealthy behavior is always a reflection of the person that's exhibiting the unhealthy
yeah.
behavior. It is never a reflection of the person who's the victim of the
Yeah.
unhealthy behavior. And anxious people that I work with struggle with self blame like there's no tomorrow. And that is
Mm.
often the number one roadblock for them to heal is that self blame.
Absolutely. Great advice. And it's exactly the same if you've been in a narcissistic relationship. People blame themselves for the narcissist's behavior, and it's never your fault how someone else behaves, and you can't make someone behave in such a way. Ryan, thank you so
Exactly.
much. I really enjoyed this
Thank you very
conversation.
much.
All
Thanks
right.
for having me. I
Thanks.
really do appreciate it.
Welcome to the Claire Odden podcast.
Every time you talk it sound like